A man appears in a video call at the top right-hand corner of a slideshow. Text, Tim Conrad, National Institute on Aging. Slide, the webinar will begin shortly. A bullet point list with links.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the National Institute on Aging's Training and Career Development Programs team today for a webinar about NIA's F99 K00 award, which supports the transition of predoctoral students to conduct postdoctoral research in the field of aging. Next slide, please.
Slide, NIA F99 K00, Transition to Aging Research.
And one more slide.
Slide, Agenda, a bullet point list.
In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, who will provide an overview of the award. After the presentation, we'll open a moderated Q&A session, so please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom at any time during the webinar. When the Q&A ends, we hope that you will share your feedback about this event by filling out a short survey. You'll find that link and many other helpful resources in the chat box. Next slide, please.
Slide, Speaker, 2 pictures with names and titles.
My name is Tim Conrad, and I'm a project director for strategic communications at Palladian Partners. I will be your moderator this afternoon, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker. Dr. Jamie Lahvic is a program officer with the NIA Office of Strategic Extramural Programs. In her current role, she helps manage communication with NIA's emerging researchers about training and career development opportunities. She also supports new initiative development and program evaluation. As one last reminder, please submit any questions you have during the presentation through the Q&A box. At the end of the presentation, Jamie will be joined by her colleague, Maria Carranza, from the Training and Career Development Programs team to answer your questions. With that, I'm delighted to turn things over to Jamie to begin the presentation.
Thanks so much, Tim, for that intro, and welcome everybody. We're glad to have you here. So the F99 K00 is one of the predoctoral awards that we are very excited about here at NIA.
She returns to the agenda slide.
So today what I will be going through is first sharing just some basic information about what the F99 K00 really is. And then giving you some tailored advice about how to craft an application for this kind of a 2-phase award. And then finally running through some more general application tips for applying for funding from the NIH. And as Tim said, we'll be finishing with some time for Q&A at the end.
Slide, the NIA F99 K00 award.
So let's start with the basics. What is the F99 K00?
Slide, what is the F99 K00? 2 bullet point lists.
So this is a 2-phase award from the National Institute on Aging, and it funds both a predoctoral and a postdoctoral research phase. So in the F99 predoctoral phase, you can receive 1 or 2 years of funding, and the project that you're researching can be either focused on aging or not. Then as you transition to the postdoctoral phase of funding, which is the K00 phase, at this point you can receive up to 4 years of funding. And at this point, a focus on aging or Alzheimer's disease is required.
Slide, what do we mean by aging research? A bullet point list.
So what do we mean when we say aging research? So the National Institute on Aging has a very wide focus on what we consider to be aging research. And I think telling you a little bit about our 4 scientific divisions can give you a sense of what kinds of aging research we are interested in. So the Division of Aging Biology is really focused on fundamental discovery research, understanding how aging works at a molecular, cellular, and organismal level, and looking for preventative and interventional strategies to address aging and extend healthy lifespan. Meanwhile, the Division of Behavioral and Social Research is really interested in the behavioral and the social inputs to the processes of aging. And they look at this both at the level of individual behaviors and social characteristics, as well as larger population levels, including impacts of demographics, etc. Meanwhile, our Division of Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology is really interested in research on how we care for aging for older adults and research on caregiving, as well as in general health and disease in older people. And then finally, our Division of Neuroscience is interested very broadly in the aging brain. So they want to understand the fundamental processes of aging in the brain, and they have a specific focus on dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So if your research or if your research goals for your postdoctoral phase fall into any of these broad areas, you might be a good fit for the F99.
Slide, F99 versus other NIA predoctoral opportunities. A table with 4 columns and 7 rows, listing 3 awards and their details.
And another common question is the F99 the right award for me? So if you're a predoctoral student looking for funding from the NIA, there are 3 major predoctoral opportunities, which are the F31 predoctoral fellowship, the R36 dissertation award, and then the F99 K00 that we're focusing on today. And these awards all have nuances. I'm not going to go through every detail of this chart here, but we are going to be sharing these slides after the presentation. But some of the things that I want to highlight is the F99. Importantly, this is the only award that does not require the aging focus during that predoctoral phase. Of these 3, also the F99 is the only one that does not have a citizenship or permanent residency requirement. However, this is also a focused award, so the timing really matters for the F99. You want to be kind of approaching the end of your predoctoral period, whereas, for instance, the F31 is something that you can apply to earlier in your predoctoral phase. And you really need to be planning to continue on to a postdoc in aging research. So if you're planning for your next career step to be something other than a postdoc, then the F99 is really not the right fit for you.
Slide, NIA F99 K00 eligibility. A bullet point list.
All right, so are you eligible for the F99 K00? Let's dive into the details here. So applicants need to be in a Ph.D. program or a similar program. These cannot be clinical or health professional doctorate programs. These cannot be dual degree programs. And that's largely because you are required to transition directly from the F99 to the K00 phase. So if you have, the end of a clinical degree that you would need to finish, if you have an internship year that you'd be required to complete at the end of your predoctoral research, then the F99 is not going to be a good fit for you. In terms of timeline in your program, when should you apply? There is not a specific timeline requirement or a specific number of years that you have to complete or that you have to be less than. However, we do require that you be at the dissertation stage. So you should have identified what lab you're going to be pursuing your dissertation research in, and you should have passed any qualifying exams that are required to get you to that dissertation phase within your program. Also, you should be planning on graduating within 2 years after receiving your award, because that F99 phase does only give you funding for up to 2 years, and then you are expected to transition directly to your postdoc. So we expect that you would be able to graduate within those 2 years of funding. Again, there is no citizenship requirement, so you can be a US citizen, a US permanent resident, or someone who is doing research in the US on a more temporary visa status. Both the F99 and K00 phases of your research must be happening at a US institution, however. So if you are planning to go to another country for your postdoctoral work, then once again, this award is not going to be a good fit for you. And what if you have already applied for or you've already received another predoctoral award from the NIA, such as the F31 or the R36? That's not a problem. You are still eligible to apply for the F99. But if you're successful in your F99 application, you're not going to be able to hold both awards at once. So at that point, you would need to transition from one award to the next.
Slide, F99 K00 annual budget. 2 bullet point lists.
All right, so if you apply and you are successful, what kind of funding can you expect to receive? So during the predoctoral phase, you would receive a stipend, and this stipend is matched to it's the same stipend as what F31 recipients receive at NIH. So it is adjusted a little bit every year. For 2023, that amount was $27,000 per year. You can also receive tuition funding up to $16,000 to offset your graduate school tuition. And then you can receive an institutional allowance of $4,500. This can help you travel to conferences, purchase equipment that you need, sign up for courses that are important for you to finish your degree, that type of thing. Then once you transition into the K00 phase, the salary starts at $60,000 per year, and it increases a bit every year that you hold the K00. In addition to that salary, you can also receive funding for fringe benefits to fund insurance, for instance. You can also receive an institutional allowance of $5,000, which again can be used for travel, equipment, etc. And then finally, your institution would receive an indirect cost of 8%. So your institution would also receive a small amount of money.
Slide, timeline, a timeline by month, and a table listing stages and dates.
So what does the application timeline look like? You all may already be aware that applying to the NIH is a long-term process. So the F99 K00 only has one due date per year, and it is normally in October. So this next due date is upcoming this October 20th. So if you are to submit during this year for the October 20th due date, your application would be under review this early spring, probably February or March of 2024. It would then have to go to the NIA Advisory Council in May of 2024. So the earliest that you could potentially start an F99 project, if your application was successful, would be in summer of 2024. So then, since you can receive between 1 and 2 years of funding, you would be finishing that F99 project somewhere between July of 2025 and July of 2026. So if you are expecting to be graduating in that range from July 2025 to July 2026, then this year is probably a good timeline for you to apply for the F99. If you expect your graduation to be further out than that, then you might want to wait a year before you apply.
Slide, crafting a two-phase application.
So that's the basics. Let me now move into discussing some advice for how to really craft an F99 K00 application. And I think the most sort of non-intuitive part of this application is how to build this application that really addresses these two separate phases. So the F99 pre-doc phase and the K00 postdoc phase.
Slide, how the F99 and K00 phases go together. A graphic illustrating the phases of the awards, along with your background and your long-term career goals.
So overall, you want your application to present a narrative where you're starting with your own background, your own expertise and scientific experiences. And then you're designing an F99 research project, which is going to include both research experiences as well as career development experiences. And your background plus these experiences that you are proposing to do during the 1 to 2 F99 years are really going to give you everything that you need to transition to your desired K00 research project, which might be in a new lab, might be in a new research area, right? Then additionally, you're going to be describing what kinds of research as well as what kinds of career development activities you're going to do during this K00 phase. And that, combined with your F99 experience and your preceding experience, is really going to launch you towards your long-term career goal. So you want to craft this narrative that's going to build up between these two stages of the award.
A bullet point list appears.
So as you're writing the research and the career development plan for the F99 phase, this should be a detailed plan, right? Because these are the next couple of years of your career. These should be a plan that is realistic to complete in 1 to 2 years. And it should really build on the existing expertise that you have, but it also should be building new skills and knowledge that you are going to need in order to get you to that K00 project that you're planning.
A second bullet point list.
For the K00 project, this is more of a general vision. You're going to want some detail, but not quite as much detail as you really should have for the F99, since this is, of course, a few years off still at this point. And some of what you do in the K00 phase might be dependent on, for instance, the research results that you get in your F99 phase. It might be dependent on the career exploration and career development that you do during the F99 phase. You want your K00 research project and the career development plans to really utilize the skills and knowledge that you have already built in your pre-doc. But additionally, you want it to be a chance for you to develop new skills and knowledge. You're not just continuing the same old thing. And that combination of this predoctoral and postdoctoral experience together will really be able to launch you into your desired long-term career goals. So importantly, at both of these phases, all of this really needs to be tailored to you. So reviewers don't want to see a generic career development plan. They want to see that you understand what your long-term career goals are and what it's going to take to get there, and that you've built up a plan that is going to get you to that particular goal.
Slide, transitioning to aging or remaining in aging. 2 bullet point lists.
All right, so there's a couple of ways to do the F99 K00 application. So I imagine some of you in the audience are already working on aging research for your predoctoral project, and then some of you are not yet doing aging research, but you are thinking about that direction for your postdoc. And so those are going to be kind of two different styles of application. So how should you go about these two styles? So if you're already pursuing aging research, then when you write your F99 career development plan, it's important for you to think about what aspects of aging research have you already encountered as a student, and what aspects do you still need to develop in. And if there are spaces where you really should still be learning about aging research, try to build that into your career development plan. In this case, you should also make sure that your K00, which will also be focused on aging research, is going to be different enough from your F99 to really give you a new set of expertise. It's not just going to be a direct continuation of your F99. Also, importantly, the K00 should give you a chance to get some independence from your PhD mentor. And maybe you would be doing that by switching institutions. Maybe you'd be doing that by moving into a research field that is different enough from your PhD mentor. But that independence plan is going to be really important. On the other hand, if you don't yet have much exposure to aging research, think about how you can use the F99 phase of your career development plan to get yourself an introduction to aging research. Can you take courses, attend a conference, for instance, to start to get some exposure to this field? Also, think about what expertise you already have that you could bring to the aging field. What kinds of techniques, methodologies, general content areas are you familiar with that really could be relevant and important to this field, and describe how that's going to contribute to your research project. And especially in this case, when you write your K00 phase, you should really have strong mentorship in aging, right? So if you are moving from not currently doing aging research, it's probably not a good idea to join a lab that doesn't have an aging focus and to have you be the only person in that lab who's going to have an aging focus. You'll probably be able to craft a stronger career development plan if you've found a mentor who really does have that aging focus. And regardless of, sort of which of these styles that you're developing for your application, the long-term career goal that you're building for should be within the area of aging research. So that wouldn't necessarily have to be an independent lab in an academic setting, but it should be a research-heavy career focused on aging.
Slide, identifying a postdoctoral mentor. 3 bullet point lists.
All right, and then another big question here is, how do you identify a postdoctoral mentor right now when you're still maybe really in the midst of your predoctoral phase? And so I do want to emphasize that at the time that you submit your F99 application, it's not required to know who your K00 postdoctoral mentor is. But some people at that phase do already have a K00 mentor chosen. So if you've already had some conversations with people, you have someone who is excited about hosting you in their lab, you should definitely collaborate with that person to write both the research strategy and the career development plan for the K00 sections of your application. You should also explain how you came to choose this mentor and how their expertise is complementary to your current mentor's expertise and to the expertise that you are bringing. Another way to go about this is to not have chosen a single specific K00 mentor, but perhaps you've started talking to folks. You have a few people in mind who you think could make a good mentor, and you're planning to do some more formal interviews, more conversation over the end of your predoctoral period until you, choose a final mentor whose lab you're going to join. So if you're in that case, in your F99 application, some of the things you'd want to talk about is, how did you identify these mentor, these potential mentors? To what degree have you already been in contact? Have you already discussed potential projects? And how are you going to choose among them, right? What kinds of expertise, what kinds of mentorship styles, what other factors are going to be important to you individually to choose the best K00 mentor for you? And then finally, plenty of applicants are also in the situation of just not having a K00 mentor identified at all. So it's perfectly fine for that to be your situation. However, reviewers are going to want to see that you do have a plan to identify a strong mentor for your postdoctoral phase. So how do you plan to meet potential mentors? How would you plan to talk to them? And most importantly, what is it that you're going to look for in a potential mentor? Are you going to look for a particular research focus? Do you need specific resources like specific equipment, specific facilities in order to complete the K00 research that you're proposing? Is there a particular mentoring style that you know is important for you, and how are you going to find out who has that mentoring style? So this is again kind of a question of a different style of how you construct your application, but all of these are sort of legitimate ways to build an F99 K00 application.
Slide, the K00 transition application, a bullet point list.
And then I do want to take a minute to talk about the K00 transition application. So this would be put down quite far down the line for all of you here. But if you are successful in receiving the F99, I just want to mention that proceeding from the F99 phase to the K00 phase is actually not automatic. Since in your initial application, your description of that K00 phase is really a vision, and it doesn't commit you to joining the institution or the lab that you specify at that phase. So once it's actually time for you to start the K00 phase, you would work with your desired K00 institution to prepare what we call a K00 transition application. And so this is a packet of materials. It's somewhat related to the initial F99 application. So it does take some time to develop, and you would need to submit it to our office at our email address here, niatraining@mail.nih.gov. And you would need to send that in to us at least 12 weeks before you plan to start your K00 funded postdoc. We then review those internally among NIA program staff. So they don't go to a study section, but there is a review process, and that can take up to 12 weeks. And so that's why we ask you to send it in early.
Slide, F99 K00 application tips.
All right, so those are my tips about how to prepare this two-phase application. And so I'd like to go in more general application tips, how to build a strong application, in particular for the F99 K00.
Slide, how to get started on an F99 K00 application. A numbered list.
So in terms of early steps in building an application, I think there are three major steps you want to think about. First is developing your specific aims. Next is preparing the major components of the application. And finally, conducting your own peer review of your application. So let's talk first about developing your specific aims. So how do you go about this?
Slide 1. Develop your specific aims. A bullet point list, a link titled Funded NIA F99s, and a screenshot of a page titled Advanced Project Search, with multiple search fields, and links to 2 other search pages.
Well, first of all, you should really work closely with your predoctoral mentor and any potential K00 mentors. So work together with those folks to design the aims that you're going to use. Once again, those aims should cover both the F99 phase and the K00 phase. I also recommend that you consult a tool that we call NIH Reporter. So this you can find simply by Googling NIH Reporter. This allows you to search for funded NIH projects. So you could also click this link once we send out the slides. This link will take you to a reporter results page. But essentially, you can search for funded F99 projects through the NIA, and you'll be able to read the abstract section of those funded projects. So you'll get a sense of what kinds of research we are funding, what's sort of the overall scope of those projects, how does the F99 phase kind of fit in with the K00 phase on those projects. So I think that's a really useful tool as you're starting to think about your own projects. And Reporter has a a really advanced search function. So you can even try to find someone who's had a funded F99, perhaps within your institution or at a nearby institution. You can look for funded projects that have keywords that are similar to some of the research that you do. So I really recommend that you use this tool.
Slide 1. Develop your specific aims. Continued. A bullet point list.
So once you've talked with your mentors, you've consulted a reporter, and you're starting to build your aims, I do also want to highlight that within the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the F99, we specify a very particular way that we need you to write your specific aims. In particular, you should have two aims. The first aim should be the dissertation research project, and the second aim should be the postdoctoral project. And so as I mentioned before, that first aim, focusing on the predoctoral page, predoctoral phase should be a detailed description of the current research you're doing and the research that you'll be completing during the F99 years. This phase does not have to be related to the NIA mission. It does not have to be aging focus. And then the postdoctoral research direction should be a more broad research direction and plans that you're going to pursue during the K00 phase. And this section really does need to be related to NIA's interest area. So you are welcome to have sub-aims, sections within these two aims, but we do really need you to write two aims that cover the dissertation and then the postdoctoral phase.
Slide 1. Develop your specific aims. Continued. A bullet point list.
And then, so once you have a draft of your aims that's kind of in this structure, please reach out to us to get feedback. So send your aims to NIA training at mail.nih.gov. I will receive them in our inbox. What I can do, I can answer any questions that you have around eligibility, policy, etc. I can tell you whether your aims kind of look like a typical good structure for an F99 with this two-phase structure. And I can share those aims with some of the program officers from our 4 scientific divisions, those divisions that I mentioned earlier. So those folks can let you know whether your K00 phase project is a good fit for NIA and is within the NIA mission areas. And they can help answer if you have any sort of more scientific questions, because they're the ones who are going to have the subject matter expertise within your specific area related to aging.
Slide 2. Prepare the major application components. A table listing application components and length limits.
All right, so once you've developed your specific aims, which are really kind of the key heart of your project, then you move on to preparing the other major components of your application. And so this is a list of all of the major components of an F99 application. And the first thing that I want to emphasize is that this is a lot of components. They're all multiple pages long, and all of them takes a lot of work actually to get them short enough to fit within these page limits. So I really want to emphasize that you should be starting to work on this early. If you're thinking about applying this October, you really should be immediately working on your application, because this takes a lot of work to build strong pieces here.
Slide 2. Prepare the major application components. Continued. A bullet point list in the table, with arrows pointing from components on the table to the bullet points.
So a few other things I want to highlight on this list. One thing that you'll notice looking at the 6 pages page limit, so you have 6 pages to talk about your research strategy. You have the same amount of space to talk about your research background and your goals for fellowship training, which are really your career development plan. And so the amount of space that we give you here really reflects the importance that we put on these pieces of the application. So we really believe that the training plan that you're developing and the career development plan that you're designing is just as important as your research strategy, because this is a fellowship award and it really is about building up your career. So please don't make that fellowship training goals just be an add-on. Please really spend some time thinking about what kinds of training and career development activities are you going to do? How are those going to serve your research goals and your overall career goals? Another major portion is the sponsor statement. So this is a statement written by your current predoctoral mentor. This also has 6 pages. So this is a major piece of your application. And what your sponsor describes in terms of what kinds of career development activities you're going to do, the ways that they're going to support you, that should really align with what you have written in your goals for fellowship training. So we want to see that you and your sponsor have been having extensive conversations and that the two of you really have a shared understanding about what your development is going to be over these F99 years and then eventually into the K00 years.
Slide 2. Prepare the major application components. Continued. A new bullet point list, with arrows pointing from components on the table to the bullet points.
I also want to highlight these two pieces at the bottom. So the certification letter, this is a letter that should come from an institutional official. So this often comes from like a department chair or a dean, someone at that level. And the letter, it's only 1 page long. They need to confirm that you are at the dissertation stage. So you have passed any qualification exam or other requirements in your program for you to be at the dissertation stage. Additionally, if you are an international student, this letter is where your institution would confirm that you do have a valid visa status that's going to allow you to finish the F99 phase of your project. You're also required to provide 3 to 5 reference letters. And these letters should be coming from individuals who are not involved in the application that you're submitting. So that means these should not come from your current mentor, because your current mentor is the one who's going to write that sponsor statement. These should also not come from your intended K00 mentor, since they really have a vested interest in this project as well. So frequently these come from past mentors, from professors who have taught your courses, folks who have perhaps collaborated with you on past projects, that type of thing.
Slide SF424 Application Guide. Screenshots of an instruction manual and a search page.
As you prepare these major application components, an important document that you should be consulting is what we call the SF424. This is the NIH application guide. This is a very long document that describes all of the rules for every single section of an application. And the way that I use this application guide, I do a lot of Control F searching because it is such a long document that that's really the easiest way to find the piece of information that you're looking for. So if you have a question about how to format a particular piece of the application, start here in the SF424. If you can't find your answer, go ahead and email us and we'll be able to help you out as well.
Slide 3. Conduct your own peer review. 2 bullet point lists.
All right, once you have assembled those major application components, before you submit, we strongly recommend that you conduct your own peer review. And so what do we mean by that? First of all, you should read through your application and try to think like a reviewer. Try to think about what are the weaknesses within the application, both in terms of potential pitfalls in the research or potential weaknesses within your own sort of career development trajectory and plan. And importantly, don't try to just hide or ignore those pitfalls. Instead, point them out, and especially within the research strategy, make sure that you're suggesting strategies to overcome these potential pitfalls should you run into them. If you're working with any collaborators on your project, you should definitely ask them to critically review the application as well. They typically have lots of good ideas. And finally, I strongly recommend that you look for feedback from some independent readers, right? So maybe some friends or colleagues within your PhD program, folks who are not within your lab, folks who don't know your project already. So ask them when they read it, do they understand the proposal? Do they get excited about this idea that you're proposing? Do they understand what the potential impact is and what the overall experimental approach is? Because these are some of the big items that the reviewers are going to want to look for and quickly understand. So if your colleagues are having trouble grasping some of those, that means that maybe you haven't communicated it as well as you thought you had, and maybe you should try a second draft, try again.
Slide Review Criteria. Section V of the Funding Opportunity. A list of questions.
As you get into this reviewer mindset, we also wanted to highlight what the actual review criteria are that the reviewers use as they're reviewing your application. And so you can actually take a look at the F99 K00 Notice of Funding Opportunity, and Section 5 of that notice spells out the review criteria. And so the reviewers read through these questions and they use these questions to judge your application. So you have all the information you need to understand how the reviewers are judging your application. And so some of the highlights there are they or think about the fellowship applicant yourself. And one of the most important questions they consider there is what is the potential of this candidate to become a productive independent aging researcher? So they're going to be thinking both about your academic and research history up to this point, but also your plan for the future. They're going to want to know whether your F99 sponsor and any proposed K00 sponsors have the appropriate qualifications to meet the needs for your individual training plan. They're going to want to know, looking at your research training plan, which means both the combination of the research plan and the goals for fellowship training. Is this a rigorous plan that has potential for significant outcomes? Are the methods that you're using scientifically sound? But also, is it overall going to foster your development as a successful researcher? They also want to understand the training potential. Is this research plan building on your skills? And is it providing an opportunity for you to develop additional skills and skills that are going to be directly applicable for a career in aging research? Finally, they're going to think about the environment and whether the scientific environment of your institution really supports both the research that you're trying to do and your overall career development plan. And I want to emphasize that because this is an NIA award, this focus on an aging career is something that the reviewers really care about and is quite important.
Slide questions. Submit using the Q&A function.
So with that, I think we will move on to the question and answer section. I see that we've already had several questions coming through, and I'll let Tim take over moderating.
Thank you, Jamie. We're now ready to begin our Q&A session. Please continue to use the Q&A function throughout the session for any follow-up questions that come to you. You can submit questions anonymously, but please note that NIA staff will be unable to follow up on anonymous inquiries after the event. If you would like to speak directly with an NIA staff member about your question, please email niatraining@mail.nih.gov.
Slide. Keep in touch with NIA training staff. Pictures of program officers Jamie Lahvic and Maria Carranza. Text. What to do next? Please share your feedback about today's event. Visit the NIA training website. Sign up for the NIA training newsletter.
Our first question is, if I'm pursuing a master's in bioethics while also obtaining my PhD, does that count as the dual degree that is not allowed for this program? If the master's in bioethics will be complete even before the PhD?
If you're going to be completing the master's before you finish your PhD, then that would be fine. So really, by dual degree, we mean the more typical dual clinical and PhD degree, where you typically have this clinical period that occurs after the PhD. In that case, when you're thinking about timing, you definitely want to think about when to apply relative to finishing your PhD degree, not relative to finishing your master's degree.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Is there any info, quantitative or qualitative, on relative success for those who have identified a K00 mentor versus those who have identified a strategy for finding one?
So we don't have quantitative numbers on that. This is a newer award at NIA, and so we don't have huge numbers of awards to look at. In my experience with sitting in on some of the review sessions, listening to the reviewers, I think it can be easier for the reviewers to sort of evaluate your K00 plan if you've already specified a mentor, because then they can ask, will this research project really make sense in that particular lab? But that is something that can kind of cut both ways, right? That can be a benefit if you've really found a good mentor who is a really good fit and reviewers can recognize that. However, if it's somebody who's not the perfect fit for the project that you're describing, reviewers will also notice that as well. So I think it's hard to say either way, but it is definitely going to be of benefit to you to start thinking about that K00 phase and to discuss your K00 project with potential mentors. So if you still have time to be reaching out to potential mentors, I think that's a great thing to be doing.
Thank you. Next question. If we receive the award, but complete our dissertation before we received a full year of funding, would we no longer be eligible for the K00 portion of the award?
That is correct. You are typically expected to finish a full year of the F99 award. So if you are already at a stage where you expect to be kind of graduating too soon to do that, it probably makes more sense for you to start thinking about postdoctoral funding, actually, right? Rather than still being applying for predoctoral funding at this point. So in that case, you might want to be planning ahead, thinking about maybe an F32 application from NIA.
Great. Next question. It seems like most of the currently funded F99s are doing aging research already. As someone not currently doing aging research, should I try to design the F99 research aims with an aging perspective or tune them as an opportunity to introduce myself to aging research?
That's a great question. So I think part of the reason that many of our current awardees are already doing aging research is because, when we do outreach for awards, most of our audience is within the aging research field. So we're doing events like this one and other types of outreach to really try to reach beyond what's currently in the aging field. So I don't believe that you're at a disadvantage if you're not doing research in aging, and I don't think it's a good idea, if you're within I don't think you should twist your current project to have an aging focus that's not naturally there, right? Just for the sake of this application. I do think in terms of your career development plan, that's a really great place to, as the questioner said, build in that experience and that exposure to aging research.
Next question is, what happens if you are awarded the F99, but then you receive a faculty position?
So the K00 funding is specifically postdoctoral funding. I think we haven't run into that situation particularly, but I know in general for folks who have, gone on to an industry job or something that's not a postdoc, then you're not able to activate the K00 funding phase.
Thank you. Next question. Is it allowed to have 3 aims, one for pre-F99 phase, dissertation phase, post-F99 phase, and K00?
So your aims should be describing what you're going to be working on kind of during the actual funded period of the award. So it doesn't make sense to have a whole aim that's focused on research that you're doing prior to the F99 starting. You can use these sort of background and significance sections of your research plan to talk about the work that you've already done and the results that you've already received. But the actual specific aims of this award should really focus on that funded F99 phase and that funded K00 phase. And once again, it's perfectly fine to take, for instance, that F99 phase and to break it up into 2 sub-aims if you have really 2 distinct lines of research that you're going to be focusing on. That's totally fine.
The next question asks, I expect to graduate in May 2025. Is F99 K00 a good fit if I apply next year?
So in remembering kind of my little timeline, we were sort of thinking between summer 2025 to summer 2026 are the folks who are on target for this coming October due date. So May 2025 would be a little bit early. However, I would say from my own personal experience, graduation timelines are not always what you hope they are. They do sometimes get delayed. And so if you think when you sit down realistically, looking at your timeline, if it's possible that you would be delayed even by a few months, then yes, the F99 could be a good fit for you to apply this coming October. Next October would probably already be too late in that case.
Our next question is, while my dissertation research is supported by another non-NIH sponsored predoctoral fellowship, could I apply for the F99 K00?
Absolutely, you definitely could. Typically, you cannot hold 2 of these types of fellowships at the same time, though that would depend on the specific kind of rules around the fellowship that you currently hold. So if you're successful in getting the F99, you would probably have to choose whether to keep the one you currently have or to move to the F99, but it's absolutely not a problem in terms of eligibility to apply.
Next question. How would aging research experience prior to the beginning of the PhD training be considered when applying? Should you have 3 distinct areas of aging research planned prior to PhD research, dissertation research, postdoc research plans?
So if you've had some aging research experience that started even before you started your PhD program, that's great. You should definitely talk about that within your bio sketch, also within your candidate background section. So certainly talk about it, talk about how that relates to your goals for the F99 phase and the K00 phase. Um, I did talk about how if you're already doing aging research as a predoctoral student, you would want that K00 phase topic to be distinct from your current predoctoral topic, enough that you have a training potential. Reviewers are not going to worry too much kind of looking backwards to your current pre-doc phase and maybe your undergraduate or post-bac or whatever pre-doc phase you had. If those 2 areas were very similar to one another, that's perfectly fine. This award is really looking at what are your future plans, what are the new things that you're going to learn that are going to help develop your career.
Thank you. Next question is about international focus. So the questioner said they read in the mission that NIA pursues this mission by funding extramural research at universities and medical centers across the United States and around the world. Can you please clarify if a project needs to have a focus in both the US and non-US areas, or is a just non-US area focus okay?
So if your research, so your research does need to be taking place in the US, so you need to be associated with a US institution. However, in terms of the research topic focus, NIA is interested in understanding aging both within the United States and abroad. So your research topic could just have an international focus. Um, I think if you have a major research component that would be happening outside of the United States, for instance, if you're planning to travel to another country to perform experiments or interviews, etc., you would need kind of an additional justification for that portion. And I'd be happy to talk one-on-one with anybody who's planning that type of thing.
Thank you. We have some questions about the application process and contents. First question, are letters of support from the K00 mentor recommended?
I think if you have someone identified, that is a great idea to have them provide an official letter saying that they are committed and they are excited about your project and that they have the equipment, facilities, et cetera, that you're going to need in order to complete that project. Yes.
And on a related note, if you have an identified K00 mentor, should you also have a sponsor statement from them addressing the K00 fellowship goals?
So there is only really space for one sponsor statement in the application, and that's just down to the structure of the application. So no, the letter of support is kind of the better way for that identified K00 mentor to provide some input. So that's typically shorter. You don't typically have as much space in a letter of support, but they can speak directly to the career development goals, the research project, et cetera, that you've specified in the application.
Great. Next question asks, if one is co-mentored by 2 advisors, should the sponsor statement be generated by both mentors together?
Yes, so you have in total 6 pages, and I've seen folks either split that up, right, where one sponsor does maybe 4 pages if they're more of your primary mentor and another does 2 pages, or you can have the 2 of them work together to come up with a single statement that's up to 6 pages that they both sign. So you can do it either way, but you should definitely have both of your co-mentors kind of contribute to the statements.
Great, thank you. Next question. Are there any tips for describing the F99 phase when my sponsor is at a different institution due to the faculty member moving?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that's always a challenge. The types of concerns that reviewers have in this case are are you going to continue to get the kind of support that you need to finish your F99 phase, even though your sponsor is somewhere else? So that can be kind of logistical in terms of how your graduate program works, and is your sponsor still like officially your sponsor in the program? That can relate to funding for your research, right? Is some of their research funding still kind of coming back to your institution in order to fund the work that you're doing? And that can really relate to mentorship. Like, are you still talking to them regularly, getting feedback from them regularly? So I think you can address that in many different parts of your application. So in your career development plan, you can talk about how are you meeting with this person and how frequently. And they, in their sponsor statement, would echo what you said, and they would describe how often they're meeting with you and how that's happening, whether that's in person, online, etc. That's also a great place for the certification level letter from your institution, for them to mention that they still fully support you where you are, and that there's sort of not any issues with the funding needed for your research or with access to facilities, etc.
Thank you. Next question is, can you elaborate on the sponsor mentor a little bit? They want to know a little bit more about who that person should be.
So your F99 sponsor, aka mentor, is typically your predoctoral mentor, the person who is advising you on your dissertation. So in some cases, people have more than one sponsor or mentor. That's fine, but hopefully there is at least one person who is really tasked at your university with seeing you through the requirements for finishing your PhD program, and that person should be writing your sponsor statement. Then at the K00 phase, your sponsor is really the person whose lab that you join to conduct this research. Another way to think about this is that the budget that is provided by the F99, it covers your stipend and a little bit and some of your tuition as a student, and then it covers your salary as a postdoc, but it doesn't provide a lot of research dollars, right? So you're going to need some other kind of research funding in order to be able to complete the research that you're proposing. So that would be coming from your mentor and the lab that you're working in.
Thank you. Next question is, do we need to submit transcripts as part of the application?
So there is a required biosketch for the application, and I believe it requires transcripts, so I would have to double check that. It doesn't, or I'm sorry, it wouldn't require official transcripts, but I believe it requires a sort of list of relevant coursework and some of the associated grades, but I would have to double check that detail. Maria, if you happen to know off the top of your head which type of biosketch is required here, feel free to speak up.
I believe the fellowship biosketch is required, which will contain that list of courses that you have referred to. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Great. Next question is, if the applicant has a potential K00 mentor or institute in mind, do they need to include this potential postdoc institute in the institutional environment section?
So the institutional environment section of your initial F99 application would really focus on that F99 institution. And then once you submit your K00 transition application, you would need to talk about the K00 institution at that point.
For our next question, because the review of this application takes about a year, is it okay if the letter from the university confirming dissertation status is this student is on track for dissertation by X date, or can this application not be submitted until a student is currently on dissertation status?
That's a great question. Yeah, so you need to be at the dissertation phase at the time of award, not at the time of application. So especially if you are in a program that maybe has sort of late qualifying exams that don't happen until year 3 or later, it's perfectly fine for your institution to attest that yes, you are on track and we expect you to be at the dissertation phase. We might do some sort of checkup on that if your application scores well, just to make sure that you have progressed as expected before we would actually make the award.
Thank you. Next question. Can the F99 and K00 be applied for separately? As in, can I apply only for the F99, but not consider K00 in the future?
No, this is a two-part award. I mean, it does happen that folks apply for the F99, K00, and their career plans end up changing and they don't end up using the K00 portion, but you are going to need to write a career development plan for the K00. You're going to need to write a research plan for that phase. So if you're not planning to do a postdoc in aging, then honestly, this application is going to be a lot of work that you otherwise wouldn't need to do. So if you are a US citizen or permanent resident and you're not looking at a postdoc, I would recommend that you think about either the R36 dissertation award or the F31 award instead.
Thank you. Next question. For many of the documents, which mentor should we focus on more, the F99 or the K00 phase? My K00 phase mentor is heavily focused on aging, but not so much my F99 mentor.
So the sponsor statement is really going to come from your current F99 sponsor, and we wouldn't need them to have a particular expertise in aging if your current research project isn't focused on aging, but they would need to be committed to the research development and career development that you're receiving during your predoctoral phase, right? So they would want to be supporting you in whatever skills that you do plan to gain. And if you are going to do some amount of kind of exploration in the aging space, they would need to be supportive of that and have kind of realistic ideas about how much of your time would that take, would some funding be required, that kind of thing.
Thank you. Next question is, for international students who have visas that are renewed every 2 years, F1 student visas, is a letter from their institution saying that they're here legally and will renew their visa when due sufficient? Technically, the visas need to be renewed every 2 to 5 years, but only when due.
Yes, that's perfectly fine for your institution. Essentially, if your institution is confident in your visa status, then we don't ask any other questions.
And on a related note, if the visa is still being processed during the application submission, can they request an extension until the visa is renewed?
So the application due date is not going to change just because of something like visa status. We would once again sort of trust in what your institution tells us about what they expect your visa status to be by the time of award. There is that full 9-month lag time between when you submit that application and when you receive the award. At the time that we would be processing an award and sending it out to your institution, we at that time would need you to have a legal visa status in order to receive it. Occasionally, we can have some small amount of wiggle room to delay the start of an award, but that's really a case-by-case situation and is not for an extended period of time. So we would be able to have that one-on-one discussion at that point.
Thank you. Next question. Is there preference given to clinical topics? Many NIH reporter topics tend to be more biological in nature, and I wonder as a behavioral scientist if this award is for me.
So as I described kind of our 4 divisions, NIA really has, we have a full division focused on behavioral and social research, and it is a major priority area for the NIA, and it's a major priority area for the F99 as well. So I definitely invite you to apply.
Thank you. Next question is, can you propose a joint mentorship for the K00? For example, 2 faculty at an institution in different fields, but with synergy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the general advice I give for anybody who's thinking about multiple mentors is make sure that there is that synergy that you mentioned. Make sure that both of those people really is bringing something useful to your application and to your personal and professional development, right? So don't just add somebody on because they have a big name or because you think it'll make your application look better. Make sure it's really someone that you plan to develop a relationship with, someone that will support you. And then the second thing to think about is make sure you don't end up in a situation where you're sort of falling through the cracks because you have these 2 people who are mentoring you, but neither one of them is really taking primary responsibility. So you would want to make sure that there's at least one of them, maybe whose lab you're officially going to be a member of, who really would be primarily responsible for making sure that your research project is on track and making sure that your career plans to get you to that next phase is also on track.
Got it. Thank you. What if it turns out that your K00 mentor is not available after all?
So you are not, committed to or required to do the K00 phase with the person that you proposed. So, if for any reason you're looking for a different K00 mentor than the person you proposed, that's fine. You can identify that new mentor. And then when you develop your K00 transition application, at that point, you do need to specify a particular person who you for sure will be working with at the K00 phase. And then we would be reviewing that new mentor and then the new research project, if the research kind of direction has changed at all in association with this mentor change. And NIA program staff would review whether that is still a rigorous and important research project and still within NIA's mission areas.
Thank you. Next question is, if you get the F99, but it takes longer than 2 years to finish your dissertation, is there a time limit for you to apply for the K00 phase?
So we do expect people to really be transitioning fairly directly from the F99 to the K00 phase, except in unusual circumstances. So we can talk one-on-one if there's something really unexpected that delays your project. But if you're looking at your graduation timeline and you're saying, I really don't, I'm really not sure if I'll be able to graduate by July of 2026, then maybe that means you should wait until next year to apply for the F99.
Great, thank you. We have a lot more questions in the queue, but we're running out of time, so we're just going to take one more.
Great.
But we'll follow up with any non-anonymous questions online. So our last question is, can you speak about the need for preliminary dissertation study outcomes in the application? What if you don't have preliminary outcomes yet since you're 2 to 3 years out from finishing?
That's a great question. And that's going to be really dependent on, the type of project you've proposed, what kind, how much of a timeline do you need before you're going to start getting results for your project. So I think what reviewers want to see is that you have made sort of good progress on your individual project. And so I think both you and your sponsor can kind of frame for reviewers what kind of progress would be expected for the type of research that you are doing. So there are some projects that just have quick turnaround experiments that really should have preliminary data, right? But there's others where maybe you're building a new tool or developing a new methodology, or maybe you have sort of a large scale data collection that needs to happen, where there's just a longer timeline before you're getting to those research results. And in that case, I don't think reviewers are going to expect preliminary data, but maybe they are going to want to know, do you have data showing that the tool that you're building is working? Or do you have, can you sort of demonstrate that the data collection is progressing at a reasonable pace, et cetera, that type of thing.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie and Maria. And thank you all for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the presentation today and discussion. Please fill out the short survey linked in the chat to tell us what you thought and help us improve future events. If you want to be one of the first to hear about those future events and other training and career development opportunities from NIA, please visit the website linked in the chat to sign up for our listserv. If we were not able to answer your question this afternoon, please reach out to niatraining@mail.nih.gov and a staff member will assist you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.